Hi everyone, I'm Jola. I'm your expert in all things related to emotional intelligence and increasing your self-awareness. And today's topic is one that is always asked about when I create reels or short-form video content, and it is resentment. Every time we make a video about this topic, a lot of you just have so many questions because it is a rather complex topic, and it is something that comes up for most couples. A lot of the clients that I work with, usually we will end up getting to a point in the conversation where we are discussing resentments and how it does show up in the relationship and then how we work through it. The topics we'll be covering today include defining resentment, understanding how it builds, understanding how it shows up in the relationship, figuring out how to work through it in the relationship, and then also how to just avoid it in the first place, like what to do so that more resentment doesn't continuously build up. And with that being said, we're going to get started with the first question, which is defining and understanding what resentment is. So as I said already, resentment is a rather complex emotion, and it often involves a cocktail of other emotions that go into the entire experience, such as anger, sadness, disappointment, or betrayal. How to know that you're experiencing resentment, essentially one way to think about it is if you are having this constant kind of like negative feeling towards someone and it's repetitive or it seems to show up at different moments, there's kind of like this bitterness or you have negative thoughts towards somebody. As resentment takes hold in the later stages of the relationship, what it can look like is more along the lines of assuming some type of negative intent towards how your partner might be showing up in the relationship, even if they do things that might feel or would otherwise be considered relatively neutral, like checking in on, your workload, checking in on if you've gotten things done, if there is trepidation in the relationship about you working too much or something along those lines, you might attribute them checking in on you as them actually applying pressure on you. So you start to assume this negative intent over neutral things that your partner might do, or even positive things that your partner might do, because there is that underlying tension in the relationship, maybe a little bit of bitterness and resentment that's showing up. So overall, the general feeling is like there is some type of injustice. It is like having been wronged, and feeling like there is negativity that has taken hold in the relationship. Okay, so how does resentment build, or how does it happen and take hold? There are, I would say, three main categories in the way that resentment shows up. And the first one is when there are unmet expectations. So what that means is you wanted something from your partner, or you thought that they would do something for you or act a certain way. You just had some vision in your mind of how things would turn out, and that doesn't happen. And when it doesn't happen, if you don't talk about that, if you don't talk that out and work through it together and let them know what you're going through and give them a chance to speak to your experience or find compromise with you or acknowledge that maybe you were looking for something and that they just weren't aware of it, or maybe they just failed to do it even if they knew. If none of that happens and you hold on to that negativity of unmet expectations, it's very likely that you will eventually start to experience some resentment. The second one is feeling pressured to do things that you don't necessarily want to do. And that word pressured is important here because it might not necessarily always be that somebody is pressuring you, like somebody is pushing you in a direction that you don't want to go. Although that can certainly happen, and for sure that would lead to resentment. But sometimes the pressure is internal or it's self-imposed, meaning you might be applying pressure on yourself to show up a certain way in the relationship. You might want to see yourself as a certain type of partner. You might be saying yes to a lot of things that actually you don't have the capacity or the space to do, because maybe you might have other negative thoughts, like your partner might not love you the same, or whatever it could be, right? So pressure in this context, it could come from a lot of places. It could come externally, but it could also come internally. But either way, if you are agreeing to things that don't necessarily sit right with you, even volunteering for things that don't necessarily sit right with you, and you don't actually check in with yourself in terms of how you're feeling in that moment and during that process, it can eventually lead to feelings of resentment later on when you sit with it, right? When you actually have a minute to reflect in terms of all that you've taken on, or maybe how people have appreciated or responded to everything you've taken on, you might notice that you do feel a sense of bitterness or resentment around that. This really also ties in with the third reason, which is essentially kind of like abandoning yourself, right? In moments where you are not true to yourself in whatever way, whether it's in terms of things like your own personal identity, things that define you, also what we just talked about in terms of agreeing to things that you don't have the capacity for. When you are abandoning yourself in any way to show up for the relationship or because you feel like you have to make the relationship work, again, it could be self-imposed or it could be from external pressures, but when that happens, eventually later on, it can lead to those negative feelings and to resentment as a whole. So let's look at some examples of what it would look like in terms of resentment that comes up from unmet expectations. So a really common example, or one that I've talked about recently, is let's say Valentine's Day. You and your partner might have talked about Valentine's Day, and you might have agreed that neither one of you wanted to do anything. And you had actually come to this agreement together, right? And then Valentine's Day rolls around, and you find, you see all these posts online. Everybody's doing something. People are out and about, and maybe you secretly start to hope that, okay, well, maybe he'll just, or she, doesn't matter, will get me something, right? Like maybe they'll get me a rose, or they'll get me like a little cupcake or a sweet treat. Maybe they'll just show up with a little something when they come home, right? Or when I see them later on. And so at that point, you're actually developing this expectation. And your partner might not meet that expectation, is probably very likely not to meet that expectation because you'd had a previous conversation. And what the hardest part about this experience is that neither one of you is necessarily in the wrong. There's nothing wrong with your partner wanting to uphold your agreement. And there's also nothing wrong with you having changed your mind, right? Having later on realized that you actually did want something, that it was important to you for whatever reason. The challenge is that the partner comes home, they've upheld their end of the bargain, you're feeling disappointed, and maybe you don't feel like you can now bring this up. So you don't, right? And you hold it inside, and that feeling starts to grow maybe more intensely, and it does become a little bit bitter, right? So that is an example of unmet expectations. So in terms of giving up a part of yourself or abandoning yourself, an example of that would be, let's assume that both of you have very busy schedules and you have your own kind of tasks going on. And maybe let's say that your partner asks for help with one of their tasks. Like maybe even though you normally don't, they've asked, hey, can you take the kids to school this morning? Right? And wanting to show up as a very, very helpful partner, you might agree and you'll say, yeah, sure, no problem. And so you go ahead and you get this done. But as you sit with it later in the day or even later in the week, and maybe you agree to more than one of these tasks, again, from that intention of really wanting to show up as a very helpful partner, you might start to realize that you didn't have the capacity for it. You now feel more drained than you had signed up for. You might start to reflect on the fact that you had an agreement and maybe your partner is not upholding their end of the agreement. And again, there's nothing wrong with not necessarily having known this at the time. There's nothing wrong with this little conflict happening. The issue is that most people won't talk about it. Even when they do recognize that this is happening, they don't actually have a conversation in terms of what this felt like and renegotiate, or at least create opportunity for their partner to indicate that they are hearing them and that they do understand what it feels like for them or what they're going through. So the reason that I picked these individual examples is because in both of these cases, the resentment usually stems from a circumstance or a previous agreement, rather than your partner just flat out having wronged you. And while that can absolutely happen and does also tend to be a common thing that leads to resentment, I think what most people don't realize is that a lot of times resentment does build from these smaller day-to-day instances. And that's why it's actually so easy to miss in the earlier stages of the relationship when it does start to happen, right? It is from these miscommunications. It is from these not having realized how you felt about it in the moment. And it is from circumstances where, both of you really did show up with the best of intentions, but nonetheless, there were circumstances where you felt resentful. Okay, so how does resentment show up in the relationship and what does it look like? Initially, and we talked about this a little bit, it's that negativity and it's that feeling of bitterness. So that is what it initially looks like. And so what that means is if you are having this feeling of negativity towards your partner, a little bit of bitterness, you're also likely to create some distance in the relationship. You might not share with them things that you previously would, right? You might withhold certain information to yourself because you don't feel like they'd get it, maybe, or you don't feel like you can totally rely on them to be there for you, right? You start crafting and weaving these stories regarding your partner's behaviors. And I think we talked about this at the very beginning, where you get that situation where you start to assume negative intent behind your partner's actions because of what the resentment feels like inside. In the later stages, when there is quite a bit of resentment in the relationship or it has sat with you for a while, something more challenging starts to happen. And so at this point, couples might actually start to engage in, let's say, some type of verbal aggression, or they might take jabs at one another, or in some challenging behaviors. And the really big issue here is that, let's say you do one of these things, you take a jab at your partner, you make a less than ideal comment or an unsavory comment, or you know that you're using a harsh tone with them, and they call you out on it. Because you've been holding so much resentment, you are very likely to feel entitled to having behaved that way, right? And what I mean by that is you feel like you should be allowed to make comments like that and say things like that because of maybe what you've endured and the resentment that you hold from their previous behaviors or actions that were less than desirable, that you never worked through, right? Whether you attempted to or not, it wasn't resolved. You still hold the resentment. And so for a lot of people, it actually does create this feeling that when your partner then approaches you with something, whether it's because of your own wrongdoing or just something that they want to work through, you've been holding on to so much of this resentment that you're not actually open to hearing them out, right? Your first response becomes, well, you know what, the ways that you've behaved in the past have been so much worse, or have felt worse, or I've held on to this for so long that, I don't care about what you're trying to raise right now or what you're going through. And so at this stage in the relationship, it does become hard to detangle, and couples start to, with each and every interaction, increase the amount of wounds that they're adding to the relationship and towards one another. So at this stage, when resentment has taken hold, that's a really good time to ask for help, to work with somebody. And you can also work with me if you like. I've put the link to my website and my services in the description box, and it'll take you directly to my page. But it's a really good time to work with somebody because clearly something's amiss, right? Whether it's from a communication perspective where you are just having a hard time getting through to each other or knowing how to raise something when you recognize that resentment's taken hold, or from even a place of knowing how to work through the resentment together and figuring out just how to have those difficult discussions and what you're supposed to do to work through the resentment. All right, so that brings us to our next point, which is how do you work through resentment? The most important thing to work through resentment is to actually have a discussion around the resentment and what an experience felt like for the person that's holding the resentment. And when you talk it out, it's really important for your partner to actually hold space to just hear that that was your experience, right? As we talked about before, there might have been circumstances where it might not have necessarily been that they did something actively, but you might still feel resentful in terms of how things played out, right? So just holding space for that, having somebody hold space for that and show up with some type of compassion or empathy, right? Which looks like showing that you get that was frustrating from them, right? That you recognize that this has actually been eating away at them. So these conversations are super, super critical. And knowing how to have these conversations and how to hold space for somebody when you have your own things that you want to work through as well can be really, really hard for couples to do, which again, it's why so many couples seek that additional help. The talking it out piece is also particularly critical for certain types of resentments that we haven't touched on yet, which are circumstantial resentments that you can't really do anything about right now, that you can't really change. So what I mean by that is, if you have financial struggles and it's neither one of your fault, right? It just is what it is, and it's something that you're struggling through, but you do feel resentful in terms of how things played out, or maybe that's not where you thought you'd be in your life, right? Or sacrifices that you've had to make towards one another, right? Whether you're taking care of a family member that you weren't expecting to take care of, right? There are circumstances where maybe nobody's at fault, and there also maybe not things that you can change anymore, right? And so in those circumstances, really all you can do to reduce kind of the fire of that resentment, the intensity of it, is to have those conversations. Because when somebody says, okay, I see you, I hear you, I get it, I get how that feels for you, how it must suck for you, when they can reflect back to you in their own words, their understanding of your experience, just that feeling of being seen that way, it really does soothe the intensity of how resentful you feel, of the negativity that you're experiencing in that moment, even if it might not necessarily change the circumstances. So it is just such a critical piece to working through resentment, especially the type of resentment where there's nothing that you can really do to alter the situation right away. In circumstances where maybe there is something that you can do, you still always do start with that compassion and that empathy as part of your discussion. And then the second part of the discussion becomes about a sustained behavior change. And so when I say sustained behavior change, what I mean is that the two of you come to some type of compromise and agreement in terms of whatever area you're holding some resentment towards. Normally, this would be something like the way you're doing household chores, the way you're splitting tasks and responsibilities, the ways you're showing up for each other in an affectionate manner, or planning things for one another. These are some areas where it can be negotiated, and most couples need to negotiate how they're showing up, and one partner might feel a little bit more resentful. So it's an area where you can actually take steps to change how you're showing up in the relationship. What's really critical about this is that it is still a compromise, it is still a negotiation. You still need to be able to actually come to an agreement together. And when I say sustained behavior change, it is not any one partner's full responsibility to just kind of fix everything, right? And to just continue to show up as a completely different person, having fixed everything. It's really more about what is one small minuscule thing that you can take accountability for, that you can comfortably start to adapt into your life and into your relationship and stay consistent with. That consistency is the absolute key. And the reason is, a lot of couples do tend to fall into this pattern where maybe they'll agree to too much in the moment, and they'll do it for a week or they'll do it for a month, and then they'll stop doing it, right? And that is just so challenging, because what that shows is that there is no long-term reliability in the relationship. So if anything, sometimes that tends to add to the resentment that already exists in the relationship. A much more effective approach is to find one small change that you can apply, and to ensure that you do remain consistent with it, to show your partner that there is growth within you, there is growth within the relationship, and things that you agree upon, you both uphold. Okay, and this leads us to the last part of our video, which is how do you avoid resentment in the future? And one of the biggest things is you catch it early. And we've talked about this a little bit, but check in with yourself before you agree to certain things, right? Check into if that genuinely really feels right with you, right? And if you're somebody who does tend to regularly have a hard time honoring how much space you have to do certain things, and you do them anyway, and then you feel resentful about it, if that is a pattern that you have, then you might really benefit from just doing some personal work and figuring out where that's coming from. And again, my services are always available if you'd like to work together on something like that. But overall, you want to make sure that the things that you're agreeing to do, overall, you feel good about it. You might not always be able to catch everything, and that's totally okay. But try to essentially increase your self-awareness in terms of how you feel about something, and offer that information up. The second thing is, let's say you weren't aware, you didn't catch it, or it just happened anyway, or maybe your partner did do something and you're not feeling very good about it in terms of the way your partner behaved or treated you. In that circumstance, it is just so critical that you raise that point, that you raise the discussion, that you communicate with your partner about it. And this is where most people go wrong. And this is actually due to something called the omission bias. And so what that is most people assume that inaction is better than action, even if the outcome is the same. Even if the outcome is equivalently negative, most people assess inaction as being less worse. The way the omission bias shows up in a relationship is most people assume that if they don't say something or if they don't raise something, then, well, at least that way there's not a fight, and they can kind of just ignore the issue, and they're just avoiding that whole negative experience. But unfortunately, what ends up happening instead is that negativity that you experience inside, that resentment, starts to fester, right? And as we talked about, what normally happens, what's very likely to happen, is you're going to feel some bitterness towards your partner. You might not see them the same. With that bitterness, there might be certain types of little aggressions. There will eventually probably be a fight. Or the relationship might be a jeopardy just because of all that you're holding in inside and the way that you feel about them. So it does actually lead to the same negative outcome, sometimes worse. And so it's just really important to recognize if you are avoiding a discussion because you do think that, well, you're avoiding the fight. The reality is that in most cases, if something is genuinely staying with you and keeps coming up for you as a negative feeling or thought, that's just not true. So this is just one of those cognitive biases to be aware of. And it does, it is something that shows up in most people and most relationships. And another thing to keep in mind with this is that when you don't share with your partner how you felt about something, especially if it was one of those circumstances where it was maybe not obvious, and they didn't necessarily know, you are essentially robbing them of the opportunity to show up for you, to want to be a better partner in this relationship, to grow in the relationship, both as a partner as well as for the sake of your dynamic together, right? And so a lot of people actually want to have that opportunity early on to be able to make adjustments. When I work with couples, what I normally see is two willing participants. Most people want to have the chance to learn to do better, as opposed to feeling like they just can't make mistakes. If you found this video helpful, give it a thumbs up. And if you want to learn more about how to dive into difficult conversations, give me a follow, as these are things that I touch on regularly.